let me return to our friend Eric Weinstein for a question that I would ask anyway, but let's have a non-Russian ask the Russian question. Ask him about the Russian concepts of friendship, science, gender, and love versus the American. You can, you can. So there is a deep romanticism that you have that runs through your book, Love and Math. Is part of that something you've picked up from the Russian culture? What can you speak to that fueled both your fascination with math and your prioritization of the human experience of love?
Good question. There is some influence of the Russian culture, Russian literature, perhaps, But also, like there's so many things. How do we develop certain sensibilities? Like, why do we care about this and not that? Like, why do I care, for instance, about, like you said, about this romantic ideals, so to speak, of mathematics? That's certainly not something that is automatic. Some people care about it, some people don't. And I'm not saying it is superior or inferior. It's just how my composition, my psychological composition is like that. And it's an interesting question, like what is the cause of it? So I think that we cannot really know, but there are some aspects of it, of course. The experiences, life experiences are upbringing, family. Like I was surrounded by love by my parents on the one hand, but on the other side, perhaps they were a little overprotective of me. So I was kind of like, too much, kind of like taken care of. So then when I had developed certain sensitivity, but was kind of not ready for the challenges
of the real
world. So then that struggle, and then being lost, and then being able to overcome and to learn, and then if you do, in other words, if you don't lose, you don't appreciate maybe. But sometimes when we lose something and then regain it, then we cherish it, we appreciate, and then become something important. Also, various difficulties, the upsetting experiences, or one could say traumatic experiences. Growing up, in the Soviet Union, that was not a walk in the park. There were a lot of issues there that I had to go through, and then it doesn't break you, makes you stronger. But in my case, what happened was that, for some of it took me 30 years to really come to terms with it and to really understand what happened. It gave me this motivation to strive to become a mathematician, which maybe I wouldn't have otherwise. It supercharged me. I'm talking about, for instance, the experience with exam at Moscow University.
Can you take me through that experience?
So this is 1984. We spoke about Orwell earlier. And I was applying to Moscow University, mathematics department. It's called Mehmat.
Which is like, for people who don't know, like the place.
It was the only place to study pure mathematics in Moscow, period.
But also considered to be one of the great places on earth.
And it's like a huge building, this monolith of a building of Moscow University. So, because, as I said, a year earlier, Evgeny Evgenyevich converted me into math, capitalizing on my love for quantum physics. And so I spent a whole year studying with him, and I was already kind of at the level of, in some subjects, at the level of like early graduate studies. So it seemed like it would be a breeze to get into Moscow University. But in fact, little did I know that there was a policy of antisemitism where students like me would be failed by special examiners, mostly during the oral exam of mathematics, but occasionally it would be written tests and stuff. Now, my father is Jewish by blood. He was not religious. His family was not religious. My mom is Russian. And But since my last name was my father's name, so it was very easy to read what my nationality was. And so there was can you imagine there were special people who would screen up applicants, who would put aside the files of the undesirables. There would be special examiners who were actually professors at this university, who would be designated as those who would take the exam from those undesirables. It's almost comical when you look back now. And also like questions why. There was no reason other than just hatred of the other. That's how I see it.
And just to give a little bit more color, so because you mentioned nationality, it's a little quirk that perhaps gives an insight to the bigger system, that the nationality listed on your birth certificate when you're Jewish is Jewish, and when you're non-Jewish is listed as Russian.
For me, it was Russian. So first of all, in the inner part, everybody has an internal passport. And there you have first name, patronymic name, last name, date of birth. So these are 4. And the 5th column is nationality, which comes from the nationality of the parents and so on. In my case, it was written Russian because my mom was Russian, but it didn't save me because that was my dad's last name. And so anyway, this was the toughest experience that I had up until that point. And there was these 2 people who came into the room where I was the only undesirable. All other kids were being questioned by other examiners, but they told me that we cannot question you. We are waiting for special examiners. So I was like, something is afoot. And so these 2 guys came, and for 4 hours, basically, were asking me questions which were not in the program and so on. But I was a kid. I was 16 years old. I tried to answer the best I can, but it was a setup. It's been documented since then. There are even lists of problems that were given to undesirables in those days. In my year, no Jewish applicants, as far as I know, Jewish by this metric, were accepted. So then I had to go to this. There was one school, technical school in Moscow, which was the Institute for Oil and Gas Exploration, which had an applied mathematics program, and that's where many of the kids who were not accepted to Moscow University ended up. And so, but the point is, and then I was so motivated by this because I wanted to show those guys, that within 5 years, less than 5 years, I got a letter from the president of Harvard University inviting me as a visiting professor to Harvard. I was 21. I was barely 21 because I already did some research in the meantime. That's how motivated I was, So, but the interesting aspect of it is that for the longest time afterwards, I was telling myself a story that nothing really happened. It wasn't so bad. Okay, so I was failed, but I knew that I was going to succeed. It was 30 years later that I finally got to meet that boy, that 16-year-old, that I neglected all this time. And I realized that he died, that it was a crushing blow.
The innocence?
Not just innocence, because there was no way. It looked like there was no way I could become a mathematician. Because if they don't accept me there, it's over. I didn't know that I could actually find this striving applied math program, and then eventually somebody would take me under his wing and so on, and then could move to the United States. That was not in the realm of possibilities. So in other words, there was nothing to look forward to. It was clear that it's over. I cannot do what I love. And so when I finally connected to that boy, oh my God, that was a totally different experience. All the pain and all the trauma came to the surface. And it was a kind of a tsunami. I wasn't sure I would survive this. It was so hard. And what happened was I was invited to give a talk about this in New York. It was kind of a spoken word event about science, but like personal experiences related to science. This was almost a year after my book came out. In my book, one of the first chapters is a chapter about this experience. But what I realize now is that I wrote it from the third-person perspective. I knew the facts, but I was not emotionally connected to that experience. However, since I wanted to write the book and to connect to my readers, I allowed the boy to write it. So a lot of people were touched by it. And people would say, wow, that chapter, it really got a lot of resonance. It was translated into other language even before the book was published. I was surprised by this because I didn't know yet. So the adult Edward was not yet in touch. But the book gave the outlet to the child. So, and that kind of started the process. So finally, almost a year later, I'm in New York at this event. And the night before, I'm in my hotel room. And I was like, okay, what am I going to talk about tomorrow? And I take a piece of paper just to, my usual preparation, for things. Yeah. And then suddenly I have this vision that I will walk up to the microphone tomorrow and I will just start crying. And I was like, by that time, I already had an insight that it's possible to have that kind of a splitting, kind of dissociation. But things were happening quickly. There was someone in my life who explained to me this idea that some things are under the radar of awareness, but they may still influence you. And a lot of that could be connected to some experiences in your childhood. So I was kind of ready for it from different angles. But I was so surprised because I was like, what is there to remember? I know everything. So then my inner voice says, all right, then you have nothing to worry about. So go tomorrow and you will speak about this. And if you start crying, it's not a problem. I was like, no, I don't want to cry in front of people. I want to find out what it is, what happened. And I sat on my bed, closed my eyes, and it came. So it's hard to describe. So this is what, and the sheer energy of it, and how much effort it took to suppress it actually for all these years. How much effort it took to build that pantsir, I want to say in Russian, that hardcore, around myself. Yeah. So that, and the thing, later I realized there were moments when it could come out. And for instance, I developed this fear of public speaking. All kinds of little things that I now feel were connected. So anyway, I saw what happened now through the eyes of that child. I saw how difficult it was, how crushed he was. And it looked completely hopeless. And I felt like, what's the point of living now for me, now that I know how cruel this world is, which I didn't realize before because I prefer to wear this pink, the rose-colored glasses. But then something happened. It's so strange. It's like you feel that inside of you there is this dead child. And it is incredibly sad. I mean, it's like, I can't even describe it. But suddenly he comes alive. And suddenly it's like, oh, he's here. And I had a little talk with him. And I said, look, I know, and now I thank you. I'm so sorry that I neglected you for so long. I didn't know. Thank you for doing this. And it's almost like, I felt like the image came to mind is like a fallen soldier. Like you leave a fallen soldier on the battlefield, a wounded soldier. And then you come back to take him with you. And I said, but look what we have done. Look at us now. It was not in vain. We are doing okay. And it's kind of almost just like holding that child and that sense of who I am, and feeling it. So the next day, I went to the microphone and I let him speak for the first time about his experience in his own voice. It was incredible. People were crying and afterwards came up to me and started sharing stories and so on. Because it is a story, it's a universal story. It's an archetypal story. It's the story of rejection and being treated unfairly. We all know it. And I think it's so important to realize that it's possible to revisit those moments. It's possible to reconnect to our little ones. It's possible to bring them back. And we are better for it because this changed my life, this experience. Then then suddenly it's like a floodgates. There were many other things that came. That's when I became interested in the dimensions of imagination and intuition and so on, because suddenly I realized that I was deprived of that possibility of looking at the world through the eyes of a child, because that child was frozen in time. I was not connected to him. But suddenly he's with me, and he's like almost like opens his doors and says, look at this, look at this. So
If I could ask you about, there's a difficult idea here. There's a tension. I've interacted with a few folks in my personal life and in general that have lived through this experience of unfairness and cruelty in the world as young people. And what wisdom do you draw from the action you took of not acknowledging that you were a victim to cruelty, but instead just working your ass off, working harder? And then the flip side of that is you eventually reconnecting with the cruelty that you experienced. Because if you did that early on,
I was not ready for it. It is a defense mechanism. I could have come. There were kids who commit suicide after this experience. I could have committed suicide because it's too much, and it is well known. Afterwards, of course, I became aware of all the literature about childhood trauma and so on, and I've been speaking publicly about it since then too, and so it is a well-known issue and well-known kind of universal phenomenon. I think that, interesting enough, even though now I see a lot of discussion of it, now that my eyes are open, but somehow before I didn't see it. So that, which also shows you how our confirmation bias, kind of like how we screen ourselves, how we turn a blind eye to things which do not confirm our views or for which we are not yet ready. And by the way, nobody should push to do it too soon. I'm glad I developed certain strengths. I was confident. I was strong to withstand this. And if I weren't, who knows how it could turn out. So it is a very subtle kind of alchemical process, which I don't think there is a recipe, there's a formula. The reason I'm talking about this is just to share this experience, because I think that the only thing we can do in this, in some sense, is to share with each other, because then we can find, for instance, if somebody shared with me, it would naturally lead me maybe to get closer to that, to kind of understanding. It's really just personal stories. It's not. Obviously, there is a component where professionals could be involved, like professional therapists and so on. In my case, it somehow happened miraculously. Well, I did have support, but not from professional therapists, but from like dear friends. So I did have. You do need. I had somebody at the time who basically held my hand through this experience. Yes, it was invaluable, and it could not be done otherwise. So I think it's very common. And here's the thing. I would not do it in any other way. When I reconnected and I saw all the horrors and so on, but I also was able to see that my examiners were victims of their own situation, that they fell for this bogus theories, or maybe it was more of a issue of career advancement or something. And I also realized they must have suffered as well, because they must have had some kind of conscience about it, that acting this way towards sort of basically kids, So it wasn't pretty from their point of view. So I could forgive them. And I could like also appreciate what a boost of energy it gave me.
Yeah.
If I was accepted and I was a first year student, I would live in a dorm because I was in the, I'd be probably partying and drinking and who knows what, maybe I wouldn't even become a mathematician. But this focused me like a laser without me even thinking about it. It just happened. I didn't care about anything but doing mathematics, and it paid off. It changed my life. So was it good or bad? Paradox.
Seems like life is full of those.